Hey folks, welcome back. Another video in the series answering your questions from TAE PD Week, early December 2024. Now, within that Slido that you saw and the survey responses that we had when we sent that out, there were lots of questions around this idea of strategies, tips, techniques to enhance learner engagement. Now, if you've followed my stuff for a little while, you know that I've talked for years and years about learner engagement and a range of different techniques that you can use and that I use periodically all the time from time to time in my workshops, in my webinars. But because we had a few questions on that issue, all framed different ways, but we had a few questions around learner engagement, I thought I'd take a moment to share three things that I did in yesterday's webinar, in webinar number 4 TAEPD week. And to enhance that, I designed in deliberately to enhance learner engagement. And many of these are super simple for you to do, very easy things for you to do. So the first one of those, and I've written some notes to make sure that I cover everything. So apologies if I'm looking over here. So the first thing, and I mentioned this in the webinar, but I'm going to highlight this here, is if you want people to do something, make it easy for them to do it. Make it easy for them to do it. And what I mean by that, in a workshop context, particularly in this online environment, if you want people to participate, make it easy for them to participate. And that very much the case online, but certainly in a face-to-face setting. If I want people to participate, one of the easiest ways that people can participate is through the app that I use all the time, which is Slido. I can get engagement. People can do it anonymously. It's low tech. Most people can navigate it. Super simple. Even beyond that, you would have seen me in the webinar yesterday asking for responses with simple numbers. I would say, put a 1 in the comments box if you are this, or if you have done this, or if you get where I'm coming from, whatever it might be, a 1, a 2, a 3, whatever it is. Now, those are very easy ways for people to interact. When I have the emoji function working, you'll notice I tried to find it yesterday and wasn't there. Yesterday being, I'd say yesterday, well, yesterday we ran the webinar, but you might not be watching this. So just moderate that. The other thing that I'll use often online is the emojis function. Get people to participate. Send us an emoji that reflects how you're feeling about this content that we've just shared or that comment somebody just made. So that's number one. Make it easy for people to participate, and there's lots of ways to do that. To keep those engagement activities relatively simple, making them relatively approachable, low tech, etc. And I'm a big fan of Slido. I don't use some of the other programs, but Slido's pretty much got everything a facilitator would want to be able to help them with participation. Number two, you would have seen me share a story or two. If I hone in on the story that I shared in episode number 4, where we were talking about the experiential learning cycle, take a second and just pause this video and see if you can recall that story. That story, if you pause there and if you can recall it, it was about my first training session. Now I've given you that prompt. Take a second, pause this, and see if you can recall what I was talking about. Now, see, how did you go there? Because the chances are with that prompt, you were able to recall some of that story. That training session went pretty poorly for me. And my reflection of it at the time and the conclusions I drew were pretty inaccurate. Now, that story, I deliberately tell stories like that are often what we call self-deprecating, that share a little bit of vulnerability, that communicate to you implicitly or explicitly that I'm not perfect. Now, why do I do that? Neurologically, the brain doesn't like people that come across as perfect. the brain understands that the human being is fallible. And so when you share a story, and particularly a story that is emotionally resonant, and we're going to talk about this in a webinar in March, a story that's emotionally resonant, and particularly one that shows a bit of vulnerability, that you're human, that's a real way of engaging your audience. So that was very deliberate. That was something that I'd built into the session, designed into the session. So that's number 2. And number 3, you might remember that I shared an analogy. I'll often share analogies as I'm working through my webinars or my sessions. What was the analogy? Do you remember that moment where I asked you to see if you could remember the 4 ingredients from a traditional lasagna? And I showed you an image of Gordon Ramsay, and I said, if you don't get it right, Gordon Ramsay's going to abuse you. Well, that was a bit of tongue in cheek. It was a bit of a joke, but many people engaged with that. If you saw the chat, it just lit up, people sharing their 4 key ingredients. Now, that was an analogy for what was coming next. And you might remember the statement I made, which was, when you're making a traditional lasagna, if you don't have these 4 ingredients, you're making something, but it's not a traditional lasagna. I then used that same statement to describe experiential learning. I said there are 4 key ingredients in experiential learning. See if you can remember what they were. 4 key ingredients to experiential learning. And I used the same statement. I said, if these 4 ingredients aren't there, you're doing something, but it's not experiential learning. Now, that's me using something that is quite relatable to most people, a lasagna, and a little bit of fun with the Gordon Ramsay piece, and then linking it to something that is moderately complex. That is this idea of the experiential learning cycle. So analogy is a great way of not only explaining things, but also getting people engaged. And the lasagna piece, if you picked up on that, that's the low stakes part. You might remember that from the start of the webinar, from episode 2. That's a low stakes contribution. What are the 4 ingredients in a traditional lasagna? Not a big deal if you don't get all 4. The very next question was the high stakes question. That was, what were the 4 elements or steps in the experiential learning cycle? Now, there is a right or wrong answer to that. So there was a couple of techniques that I was using there to drive learning and engagement at the same time. So I hope that answered the several questions that we had around tips and techniques. There's 3 for you, or maybe 3.5. Go and watch this video back. I hope you made a note of a few of those. It's a long video, but it's an important one. There you go. Bye for now.